she had $4.06, a single leather valise, and a letter addressed to a dead man. A letter a dying old cowhand had written, knowing full well that the husband it was addressed to was already 14 months in the ground, because the person he truly needed was the widow who would open it. For 5 years, Clara Abernathy had been the sharp, invisible mind behind every land fraud case her husband put his name to. She read the law, found the lies, built the cases, and watched a judge shake a dead man's hand for work that her own hands had done. Now she had nothing left, and the only reason she bought that train ticket was because a dying man had seen what the world refused to see, and trusted her with the lives of people she had never met. What happens when a woman who spent half her life working in the shadows finally steps into the open, sits down across from a corrupt sheriff, and delivers a legal reckoning so clean and so precise that the most powerful man in the county goes pale over his morning coffee? Stay with me, because before this story ends, you will understand that the people we bury do not always leave us. Sometimes they step back just far enough to crack a door open, and leave us to decide if we are brave enough to walk through it alone.
The slice of the paper knife sounded too loud in the quiet room. It was the morning of March 14, 1878. Wichita Falls, Texas. Clara Abernathy sat on the edge of a bed that felt more like a coffin. She stared at the envelope in her hand. $4.06. That was all she had left in her leather coin purse. The local schoolhouse had shuttered its doors the previous Friday. They were out of funds, out of patience for a widow with no family ties. The letter in her lap had been stuck in the postal relay for 4 months. The postmark read November 1177. Addressed to Henry Abernathy. Henry had been in the ground for 14 months. Clara didn't cry. Her tears had dried up long before the first frost of winter, but her hands trembled as she held the thick parchment, not from grief, from the sudden, heavy shock of seeing his name written as if he could still answer, not the late Henry, just Henry, like he was still out there somewhere waiting for the mail. She pulled the folded pages free. The handwriting was shaky, an old man's script, written in dark green ink. The name at the bottom read Arthur Pendleton. Clara read the letter once, then she read it again. Arthur was an aging cowhand, 71 years old, dying of lung rot. He had no children of his own, but he had worked the Montgomery Ranch out west for 11 years. He loved his boss, a man named Silas Montgomery, like a son. But Arthur had a secret. He wrote to Henry because Henry was the only man he had trusted from the old cattle trades. Arthur knew that the local law sheriff Amos Thatcher was plotting to steal the Montgomery land. Fake deeds. Paper, a quiet robbery dressed up as the law. Arthur's plea was desperate. He wanted Henry to come to the Panhandle. Lascelles is the best man I know. The green ink read, but he's too damn proud to ask for a rope while he says drowning. Someone's got to throw it before he goes under and loses it all. A postpost plea from between the folds and fluttered onto Clara's lap. It was a bank draft. $60. I'll use this for the train. The postscript read, "Consider it my pay." Clara stared at the money. $60 was a small fortune. It was enough to pay her rent and buy food for 3 months, or it was enough to buy a one-way ticket to Amarillo. With enough left over to start fresh, she was trapped. The material trap was plain. She had no job, no home to return to. The money was a lifeline, but the moral trap was heavier. Clara was not Henry Abernathy. She couldn't do what Arthur asked. She was just a widow. Nobody knew that for 5 years she had been the quiet mind behind Henry's land investigations. She was the one who read the law books late at night. She was the one who found the loopholes. But a woman's name was never put on the official reports. If she didn't go, no one would. A decent man out west would lose his home, and he wouldn't even know why. Clara looked at the worn floorboards. She spoke aloud to the empty room, her voice steady. When a dying man places his faith in a dead man, the only living person standing between them doesn't have the right to walk away. You honor the trust, or you lose what's left of your soul. She didn't have a choice. Not really. Packed her single leather valise. 4 days later, the Amarillo train tipo. The wind tasted like grit and broken promises. Clara stepped down from the passenger car, her boots hitting the wooden platform. Her legs ached from the long ride. The town was loud, bustling with cattlemen and merchants. Her plan was simple. Find the Montgomery ranch, hand over the letter, explain that Henry was gone, then use the rest of the money to find work in town. She took a step forward, scanning the crowd. Her boot caught the uneven edge of a loose floorboard. Clara stumbled. Her valise hit the dirt, her coat swung open, and the letter, Arthur's letter, slipped from her pocket. The Texas wind grabbed it, skittering it across the platform. A heavy, dust-covered boot stepped on the paper, pinning it down. Clara looked up. A man stood over her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn leather duster. His face looked like it had been carved out of prairie rock. He was clearly in a hurry, his jaw set hard, his eyes focused on something in the distance. He saw her fall. He stopped. He didn't step around her. He didn't ignore her. He reached down, a large, calloused hand wrapped gently around her elbow. He pulled her up to her feet. It was an effortless motion, steady and careful. He brushed the dust from the sleeve of her dress. He didn't make a fuss, didn't offer empty pity. It was just the quiet, natural reflex of a man raised to shield those who fell. "You hurt, ma'am?" His voice was low, gravel and smoke. Clara said, catching her breath. "Thank you." The man nodded once. He bent down to retrieve her fallen letter. As he picked it up, his eyes caught the writing on the envelope. He froze. He stared at the name he had seen 1,000 times in his own ledger. Silas Montgomery, Montgomery Ranch. Silas looked at the envelope. Then he looked slowly up at Clara. He knew instantly she wasn't Henry Abernathy. His expression didn't change. A single muscle in his face twitched, but Clara saw his large knuckles turn white as his grip tightened on the paper. The protective gentleness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating guard. He stared right through her. "Have you read this?" he asked. Clara held his gaze. She didn't shrink back. Silas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut right through the howling wind. "Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" The depot cafe smelled of burnt coffee and old grease. Silas didn't say a word on the walk over. He just kept his hand lightly near Clara's elbow, guiding her through the bustling Amarillo crowd. He pulled out a chair for her. A gentleman's habit, worn but not forgotten. He sat across from her. He placed the letter on the scarred wooden table. Outside, the wind threw dirt against the glass. Inside, the silence between them felt heavier than the weather. He dropped 2 thick mugs of black coffee on the table. Silas didn't touch his. He just looked at Clara. His eyes were the color of a winter sky. Cold. "Arthur is dead," Silas said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact he had already swallowed. "I assumed as much," Clara replied softly. "The letter was delayed. 4 months." Silas nodded once. He tapped a calloused finger against the envelope. "And Henry Abernathy?" 14 months in the ground," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. She was done apologizing for the hand God dealt her. Silas leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked under his weight. Tired, not the kind of tired a good night's sleep could fix. It was a bone-deep weariness, the kind a man gets from carrying too much for too long. "Arthur was a good man," Silas said, "but his mind was going at the end. He had no business dragging Henry into this, and he certainly had no business dragging you. He didn't drag me. I bought the ticket. Then you can buy a ticket back." Silas pulled a leather wallet from his vest. "I'll pay for your return fare. You shouldn't be here." Mrs. Abernathy. Clara didn't reach for the money. Wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. The heat felt good against her cold skin. "Your ranch is in trouble," she said. Silas stiffened. The gentleman slipped away, replaced by the hardened cattleman. "A paper dispute. I handle my own affairs." Arthur believed. "Sheriff Thatcher is going to take everything you have." Arthur was a dying man with time to worry. Silas clipped. "I can handle it. I always handle it." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. She knew that look. Seen it in the mirror every morning for over a year. It was the look of a person drowning in their own pride, someone who would rather sink to the bottom than yell for a rope. "How?" Clara asked. Silas frowned. "Excuse me. How are you handling it, Mr. Montgomery? Do you have the original deed? Are you comparing the survey lines? Have you checked the county registrar's ledger matching dates?" Silas went perfectly still. His jaw tightened. He didn't have the answers. The only lawyer in Amarillo he trusted had suddenly moved to Austin. The rest were in Thatcher's pocket. Silas was a man who understood cattle, weather, and honest sweat. Did not understand the quiet, dirty warfare of legal ink. Clara opened her leather valise. She didn't pull out a handkerchief to weep. She didn't offer a gentle smile of pity. She pulled out a stiff piece of paper and slid it across the table. Silas looked down. It was a teaching certificate. from the University of Virginia, dated 1862. Specialty in literature and civil law. I am not a lawyer, Clara said, her voice steady. But I taught American legal history for 8 years. I know how to read a land claim. I know how to find a lie on a piece of paper. Silas stared at the certificate, then he looked at her. Give me 30 days, Clara said. Give me a room, 3 meals a day. In exchange, I will sit in your office and read every piece of paper. Amos Thatcher has found the hole in his net. Silas didn't speak. I don't want to wage, Clara added. I want to trade my mind for your roof. Silas studied her face. He was looking for weakness, desperation, but all he saw was a mirror of his own stubborn pride. I am not in the habit of having a woman handle my paperwork, Silas said quietly. It wasn't an insult. It was just the way his world worked. Clara didn't blink. She sat up a little straighter. The truth in black ink doesn't care about the gender of the person reading it, Mr. Montgomery. She stated it as a simple fact, a law of nature. Competence has no sex. A forged date is a forged date, whether a man or a woman points it out. Both in a corner. I need a place to stay. You need someone who can read the devil's handwriting. Why let pride kill us both? Silas held her gaze. A slow, barely visible shift happened in his eyes. Respect. It was hard-earned and sudden. She wasn't asking for charity. She was proposing a partnership of necessity. He slid the certificate back across the table. All right, Silas said. His voice was all gravel now. Clara folded her hands in her lap. Name them. One, you don't ask about my late wife. Ever? Agreed. 2. I have a 16-year-old boy. Elis, you don't interfere with how I raise him. You aren't his mother. Try to be. Clara felt a slight sting at the bluntness, but she nodded. Agreed. 3. Silas leaned in. When the 30 days are up, you leave. Regrets, I won't owe you anything else, and you won't owe me. 30 days, Clara echoed. Silas stood up. He left a silver coin on the table for the coffee. Grab your bag, Mrs. Abernathy. My wagon is out front. The Montgomery Ranch sat 20 miles west of town. It was a vast, sprawling kingdom of dry grass and harsh wind. Clara didn't talk much on the ride. Silas talked less. She was given a small room near the back of the house. It was clean, Spartan, and cold. This morning, Silas showed her the ranch office. It was a mess of ledgers, old surveys, and tax receipts stuffed into wooden boxes. She went to work. Day 3, the afternoon, sun baked the window panes. Clara sat on the floor, surrounded by stacks of paper. Her hands were stained with dust and old ink. Her back ached. The door creaked open. Clara looked up. Standing in the doorway was Elias. He was tall, gangly, wearing clothes he was quickly outgrowing. His father's eyes. Wary, he didn't say hello. He didn't ask how she was doing. He walked in carrying a tin cup of hot coffee. He set it down on the edge of the desk. Near her, he lingered for a second, just a second. Clara didn't gush with thanks. She didn't try to force a conversation to win him over. She just nodded. You, Elias. The boy gave a short, awkward nod back and slipped out the door. Clara wrapped her cold hands around the tin cup. It was a small thing, but in a house that had forgotten how to speak, a cup of coffee was a conversation. It was acceptance. Day 7, a late spring storm had blown through the night before. Clara woke at 5 in the morning to the sound of a hammer echoing across the yard. She pulled a thick shawl over her shoulders and stepped out onto the porch. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Out near the western pasture, Silas was working. A section of the barbed wire fence had snapped in the wind. Out there alone, struggling to pull the heavy biting wire taut while trying to drive a staple into the post, Clara walked out into the wet grass. She didn't call out. She didn't ask if he needed help. She simply walked up, grabbed the heavy leather grips lying on the ground, clamped them onto the loose wire, and pulled back with all her weight. Silas jumped, surprised by the sudden tension on the line. He looked over. Clara's boots dug into the mud. Her breath plumed in the cold air. She didn't smile. She just held the wire steady. Silas didn't tell her to go back inside. He didn't tell her it was man's work. He turned back to the post, raised his hammer, and drove the staple deep into the wood. They worked like that for 90 minutes, moving from post to post, not a single word spoken. Just the rhythm of the wind, the pull of the wire, and the crack of the hammer. When the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the plains in gold, the fence was whole again. Silas wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. He looked at Clara. Her dress was muddy. Her hands were red with cold. A steady line, Silas said. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't a romantic declaration. But to Clara, it felt warmer than any compliment she had received in years. It was respect. My father was a carpenter before he was a teacher, Clara said quietly. I know how to hold a line. Silas nodded. He picked up his tools. They walked back to the house side by side. Day 12. Clara found the first thread. She was cross-referencing a county tax ledger with a surveyor's map from 1861. Carried the heavy book out to the barn, where Silas was brushing down his roan gelding. "Look here," Clara said, resting the book on a barrel. Silas stopped brushing. He walked over. The ink on the 1 in 1861 is different, Clara pointed with a slender finger. The rest of the date has faded to a dark brown. That happens with iron gall ink over a decade. But the one is too dark, too sharp. Someone scraped away a zero and wrote over it. Silas stared at the page. If this survey is from 1860, not 1861, it means Thatcher's claim of an overlapping boundary is completely void. Your grandfather's claim predates his by a full year. Silas was silent for a long time. The only sound was the horse shifting in its stall. Arthur suspected this 2 years ago, Sickles said. His voice was strangely soft. He spent months trying to prove it. He couldn't. He looked up from the book. He looked at Clara. "You found it in 12 days. There was something new in his expression. The wall of pride he wore like armor was cracking. Just a little. Day 18. The afternoon was hot and dry. Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. The breaking pen, Elis was working a young, spooky colt. Silas was miles away, checking the other, and heard the boy was trying to show he was a man, pushing the animal too hard. The colt bucked, hard and twisting. Elis lost his stirrup. He was thrown through the air, landing with a sickening thud in the hard-packed dirt. A cloud of dust plumed around him. The horse bolted to the far end of the pen, snorting in panic. Elis didn't get up. Clara dropped the wet sheet, ran to the fence, climbed over the wooden rails, and hit the dirt. But as she got close to the boy, she slowed down. Elias was curled on his side, gasping for air. The wind had been knocked clean out of him. He was panicking. Tears of pain and embarrassment welling in his eyes. A mother's instinct, a normal woman's instinct, would be to fall to her knees, grab the boy, cradle his head, and cry out in worry. Clara didn't do that. She knew boys. She knew pride. And she knew that smothering a young man's pain only made him feel smaller. She walked up slowly. She knelt down in the dirt, keeping her distance. Made sure she was at his eye level. "Breathe, Elias," she said. Her voice was flat, calm, and steady, like an anchor in a storm. The nose out through the mouth. The boy gasped, clutching his ribs. "You have the wind knocked out of you. It's going to hurt for another 10 seconds. Just breathe." Elias struggled, but he listened to her cadence. After a few agonizing moments, his lungs caught. He took a ragged breath. "Good," Clara said. Edwin reached out to pet his hair. "Where does it hurt the most?" "Show me." My shoulder," Elias gritted out. "And my leg." "Move your toes." He wiggled his boots. "Now squeeze my hand." She offered her hand. He gripped it hard. "Nothing is broken," Clara said, matter-of-factly. "You're bruised. You're going to be sore tomorrow. Take your time getting up. There's no rush." She sat back in the dirt. She didn't hover. She didn't preach about being careful. She just sat there, being a quiet, steady presence while the boy collected his dignity. True care doesn't always come with soft words and smothering hugs. Sometimes, true care is just having the grace to let a person hurt without making them feel weak for it. Unknown to Clara, a rider had stopped at the edge of the yard. Silas sat on his horse, watching the scene unfold. In the pen, he had seen his son fall. He had kicked his horse into a run, his heart in his throat. But when he saw Clara climb the fence, he pulled back on the reins. He watched her kneel. He watched her stay calm. He watched her give his son the space to be a man, even while he was hurting. Silas swallowed hard. There was a tight knot in his throat that had been there in 6 years. He had brought this woman here to fix his papers, to read the ink. But as he watched her sitting in the dust beside his son, Silas realized something terrifying. She was fixing more than just the ranch. The dust on the horizon didn't belong to a stray calf. Silas saw it first. He was standing on the porch, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He stopped. His eyes narrowed. He watched the thin brown cloud rise against the blue sky. Day 20 of Clara's stay, a single rider was coming up the wagon trail. Not rushing, taking his time. The horse was a fine black gelding. The saddle was too expensive for a working cowboy. "Elias," Silas called out. His voice was low, calm. "Take that colt around to the back pasture. Stay there until I call you." The boy didn't ask questions. He took one look at her face, grabbed the lead rope, and led the horse away. I stepped out onto the porch. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Company?" she asked. "Trouble," Silas replied. The rider pulled up to the hitching post. He dismounted smoothly. He didn't look like a cattle rustler. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a gentleman. Sheriff Amos Thatcher wore a tailored broadcloth suit under a clean duster. His boots were polished. The silver star pinned to his chest caught the afternoon sun. He took off his hat and wiped his brow. His hair was neatly parted. He had a handsome face. Face folks trusted at a Sunday sermon. That was what made him dangerous. "Afternoon, Silas," Thatcher said. He smiled. "It was a practiced, easy thing, Amos," Silas said. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't invite the man onto the porch. Thatcher didn't seem to mind. He stepped up to the bottom stair and leaned against the wooden railing. He looked around the yard. He took in the repaired fence, the sturdy barn, the rolling acres of prime grazing grass that stretched out toward the horizon. "Place is looking good," Thatcher said. "Grass is holding up well, considering the dry spring." "It holds up fine," Silas said. "What brings you out, Amos? It's a long ride from town just to check my grass," Thatcher chuckled. He slapped his hat against his leg, knocking off the road dust. "Just a friendly visit," Thatcher said. "And a bit of county business, you know how it is." "Willow is growing, Silas. The railroad is bringing in folks by the dozens every good folks, families." "Has plenty of lots for sale," Silas said. "Town is cramped," Thatcher countered smoothly. "These folks need small plots, a place to farm, a place to breathe." He gestured toward the vast expanse of the Montgomery Ranch. "Now a man with 2,400 acres? Well, a man might realize that he has more than his fair share. A man might see the moral good in stepping aside to let the community grow." Clara stood silent in the doorway. She watched the exchange. She saw the implied lesson right there in the dust. True evil rarely announces itself with a gun. It dresses up as the greater good. It uses words like community and fair share to mask simple greed. Thatcher wasn't trying to help poor families. He wanted to break up the ranch, sell the parcels, and pocket the heavy commissions. "My grandfather shed blood for this land," Silas said. His voice was steady. It didn't rise an inch. "Father broke his back pulling rocks from this dirt. It's not a question of what the community needs. It's a question of what is mine under the law." Thatcher sighed. It was a heavy, theatrical sigh. The sigh of a reasonable man dealing with a stubborn child. "The law is a tricky thing, Silas," Thatcher said. "A man shouldn't hoard what the community needs. It breeds resentment, and sometimes old deeds, well, they turn out to be flawed. Mistakes get made in the surveyor's office. Boundaries shift. Just looking out for you. If the county finds that your claim overlaps with public township grants, the courts will step in. It could get ugly." There it was, the threat, wrapped in velvet. A lawful claim doesn't shift because a sheriff wants to play real estate broker, Silas said flatly. Thatcher's smile tightened. The warmth left his eyes. He finally looked past Silas. He looked at Clara. "And who might this be?" Thatcher asked. He tipped his head. "No, you took on a housekeeper." "I didn't," Silas said. "Mrs. Abernathy is helping me sort through some old paperwork." Thatcher's eyes flicked up and down, evaluating her, dismissing her in the same breath. "Paperwork," Thatcher mused. He put his hat back on. "Well, I've heard you were having some trouble with the county clerks. If you need help, Silas, my office is always open. I'd hate to see a good man lose his livelihood over a clerical error." He looked right at Clara when he said the next words. "So some messes are too big for a woman to clean up." Clara didn't flinch at his gaze. "In my experience, Sheriff, messes are usually made by men who think no one is watching," Clara said quietly. "A broom sweeps the same, regardless of who holds it." Thatcher stared at her for a long second. The smile vanished completely. He turned back to Silas. "Think on what I said. Silas, the town is growing. Don't stand in front of the train." He mounted his horse. He tipped his hat once more and rode back down the trail. Silas stood on the porch until the dust settled. "That's him," Silas said. "I know," Clara said. "The one pushing the forged papers through the courts." Silas rubbed his jaw. "You heard him. He's dressing it up as charity. He's convincing the whole town that I'm a greedy baron starving out the new settlers. By the time he takes this to a judge, the jury will be begging to hang me." Cla stepped up beside him. "He has the badge." He sounded tired again. "Do you have proof?" "Not yet," Clara said. "We have 10 days left, I know." "He's smart, Clara. He wouldn't push this if he didn't cover his tracks." "Everyone leaves a track," Clara said. She looked down the empty road. "He thinks I'm just a widow trying to earn a meal. He thinks my mind is small. That is his weakness." She turned and went back inside. She had work to do. The ranch was asleep. The only sound was the wind rattling the glass panes of the office window. Clara sat at the heavy oak desk. The oil lamp flickered, casting long dancing shadows against the walls. Her eyes burned. She had been reading for 6 hours straight. She rubbed her temples. A sip of cold, bitter coffee. She pulled the next file from the box. It was a copy of the town's new zoning ordinance. Thatcher had filed it in Austin 6 months ago. Alongside it was a copy of the Montgomery Master Deed. Clara laid them side by side. She had already found the scraped date in the ledger. That was a start. But it wasn't enough to hang a sheriff in a federal court. She needed the mechanism. She needed to prove exactly how Thatch Hatch was stealing the land legally. She ran her finger down the tight cursive script of the surveyor's notes. By northwest, 300 paces from the split oak, following the dry creek bed, she stopped. Her finger hovered over a single paragraph in Thatcher's new zoning filing. She read it. Then she pulled out a map. She looked at the boundary lines. Her heart gave a hard, sudden thump against her ribs. She knew this trick. She hadn't seen it in Texas. She had seen it in Virginia. 5 years ago, it was called a floating boundary scheme. The forger didn't change the size of the land. He simply changed the fixed landmark references in the renewed county filings. By legally redefining which split oak and which dry creek bed marked the starting point, the entire grid of the ranch was shifted on paper. It pushed Silas' legal claim 2 miles east right into barren, rocky land he didn't own, and freed up his prime water access acres for Thatcher to claim as unowned public land. It was brilliant. It was invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. Clara stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. She grabbed the papers. She walked out of the office and down the dark hall. She didn't knock on Silas' door. Pushed it open. Silas was sitting on the edge of his bed. He wasn't asleep. He was unlacing his boots in the dark. He looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. "Light the lamp," Clara said. Her voice was breathless, shaking. Silas didn't argue. He struck a match and touched it to the wick on his nightstand. The room glowed yellow. Clara walked in and dropped the papers right on his mattress. "This," she ordered. Silas frowned. He picked up the papers. "Clara, it's 2 in the morning. Read the landmarks on your grandfather's deed," she interrupted. Then read the landmarks on Thatcher's new county filing. Silas squinted the paper. He read them aloud. "North by northwest, 300 paces from the split oak." "Thatcher's paper says north by northwest, 300 paces from the Exactly," Clara said. Her eyes were blazing. "Is there a burnt oak on your property?" "No," Silas said, "but there's one 2 miles east on the ridge. Lightning struck it a decade ago." "Thatcher changed the anchor point," Clara said. Pacing the small moved it. "On paper, your 2,400 acres still exist. But legally they are now sitting on top of the useless rock ridge." He shifted the grid. "That leaves your prime grazing land and your river access legally undefined, unclaimed, ready for him to seize and sell." Silas stared at the paper. He read it again. The color drained from his face. "My God," he whispered. So simple, so devastatingly quiet. He looked up at Clara. The confusion in his eyes slowly turned into shock. "How did you spot this?" Silas asked. "I had a lawyer look at these filings 3 months ago. He said the deed was sound." "Your lawyer was looking for a stolen title," Clara said. "He wasn't looking for a shifted map." "But how did you know?" Silas stood up. He towered over her in the small room. He looked at her not as a widow, but as a total stranger. "You taught legal history. You said you read old cases." "This isn't history, Clara. This is a live, complex forgery. This takes a trained eye." Clara stopped pacing. She looked at him. The silence stretched between them, heavy, fraught. "It was time to drop the veil. My husband Henry was a cattle bearer," Clara said slowly. "That was his public profession, but privately he was hired by ranchers in the Shenandoah Valley to investigate land fraud after the war." Silas listened. He didn't blink. "He was a good man," Clara continued. "He was brave. He could talk to anyone. But he didn't have the patience for paper. He didn't know the law." Clara took a step closer to Cy. Cy's brow furrowed. "You for 5 years," Clara said, her voice dropping, "filled with the weight of a ghost life. I sat in the back rooms of county courthouses. I read the deeds. I tracked the false surveys. I wrote the reports that Henry handed to the judges. I built the cases that sent 3 corrupt officials to federal prison." She looked down at her hands. "Palaces, the ink stains, but it was 1,872 point. A judge wouldn't listen to a woman. A rancher wouldn't pay a woman. So Henry put his name on my work. He was the investigator." Silas was speechless. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. He had assumed so much. He had looked at her worn dress. He had looked at her empty coin purse. Assumed she was a desperate, educated schoolmarm grasping at straws to keep a roof over her head. He had no idea he was harboring a veteran of the very war he was fighting. 5 years, Silas breathed. You've done this for 5 years. Yes. Silas shook his head. He looked almost angry. Not at her, at himself. Why didn't you tell me? Silas asked. His voice was thick with disbelief on that first day in the cafe. Why didn't you just tell me who you really were? Clara looked straight into his eyes. This was the lesson. Hard, bitter truth about how the world saw her, how he had seen her. Because you didn't ask me who I was, Cecil. Her words were soft, but they hit like a hammer. You looked at my patched coat, you looked at my gender, and you decided exactly what I was. You didn't ask about my mind, you only asked what I needed to survive. Silas flinched. The truth of it stung. He had been proud. He had offered her a room out of a sense of tough charity, believing he was doing her a favor by letting her try to read his papers. Clara turned toward the door. A person's worth isn't measured by what they lack, she said quietly over her shoulder. It's measured by what they carry inside. You have your proof, Silas. Tomorrow we go to town. She walked out, leaving the door open. Silas stood alone in the lamplight. He looked at the forged paper in his hand. Then he looked at the empty doorway. He felt entirely foolish. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt a profound, undeniable sense of awe. The Texas night was deep. It swallowed the horizon whole. Day 27. The air had finally cooled. The wind had died down to a soft whisper through the buffalo grass. The house was quiet. Elias had gone to bed an hour ago. Clara sat on the wooden porch swing. She didn't swing, she just sat. She was too tired to move. The legal case was almost built. They had the forged dates. They had the shifted landmarks. It was a tight, solid net. Her mind was still racing, turning over the details. The screen door creaked open. Silas stepped out. He carried 2 small glasses and a bottle of amber whiskey. He didn't ask if she wanted company. He didn't ask if she drank. He just set the bottle on the small table between the chairs, handed her a glass, and poured 2 fingers of liquor into each. Then he sat down in the rocking chair next to the swing. They didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't the stubborn silence of 2 strangers trying to prove a point. It was earned. The quiet of 2 people who had spent nearly a month carrying the same heavy load. Clara took a sip. The whiskey burned sharp and clean, all the way down to her chest. Silas leaned back. He looked up at the stars. Her name was Sarah. Silas said. His voice was rough, quiet. It was the first time he had spoken of his wife in 6 years. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't turn to look at him with wide, pitying eyes. She kept her gaze on the dark horizon. She knew that if she looked at him, he might stop. Some truths can only be told to the dark. She was from Richmond. Silas went on. A city girl. She liked music. She liked neighbors. She liked the way the trees looked in the fall. He took a slow drink. I met her on a cattle drive. We married 3 weeks later. I promised her the world. I told her the West was wide open. A place to build an empire. He gave a short, bitter laugh. It sounded like tearing canvas. I brought her to a desert. I brought her to a place where the wind howls for 3 straight and the nearest neighbor is a half-day's ride. She hated the quiet. She hated the dust. Silas gripped his glass. His knuckles shone white in the moonlight. She tried to love it because she loved me. She smiled when I came in from the herd. She kept the house clean, but I watched her fade year by year. Flour left out on the anvil in the noon sun. By the time she got heavy with our second child, it was just a ghost. He stopped. The crickets chirped in the long grass. The baby came early. Silas whispered. The words were jagged now. Tearing the doctor was in Amarillo. A storm washed out the trail. I was stuck here, just me and a terrified woman. The baby didn't make it. Sarah didn't make it either. Bled out in that room. Down the hall, he put the glass down on the table. Hard, I killed her, Silas said. It was a statement of absolute conviction. I was too proud to stay in Virginia. I wanted my own land. I thought love was enough. I thought love could make up for everything. A person gives up. I was wrong. Clara sat still. She let the words hang in the air. Most people would rush in. They would offer comfort. Say it wasn't your fault. They would say you did your best. They would try to erase his pain, because watching a strong man break is uncomfortable. Clara didn't do that. She offered him the deepest form of respect. She let him hurt. She sat beside him in the dark, steady and unmoving, anchoring him simply by not running away from his ugliness. Her presence was the silent lesson. I see your guilt, and I am still here. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and clear. You didn't kill her. Silas, I brought her here, he argued blindly. Yes. I did, Clara agreed. She wouldn't lie to him, and she chose to follow you. You made a choice out of ambition. She made a choice out of love. Neither of those things are sins. Silas put his head in his hands. Grief is a tricky thing, Clara said, turning her head to finally look at him. People talk about it like it's a debt, like it's a ledger book. If you just feel bad enough, for long enough, you'll eventually pay the toll and balance the account. But it doesn't work that way. Silas didn't move, but he was listening. Grief isn't a ledger you balance, Clara said firmly. Words held the weight of an educator and the scars of a widow. It is a room, a dark, strange room built right in the middle of your house. In the beginning, you walk into it every day and you trip over the furniture in the dark. It bruises you. It breaks you down, but over time the room doesn't go away. The furniture doesn't move. You just learn where the sharp edges are. You learn how to live in the house without bumping into the pain every single time you move. Silas slowly lifted his head. You loved her the best way you knew how at the time, Clara said. That doesn't erase the tragedy. It doesn't fix the loss, but it means you weren't wrong to love her, and she wasn't wrong to love you. Silas looked at her. The moonlight caught the silver streaks in his hair. It caught the quiet strength in Clara's eyes. He had punished himself for 6 years. He had built a fortress of isolation, calling it independence, when really it was just a prison built of guilt. He looked at Clara for a long time. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't lean in to kiss her. That wasn't who they were. The intimacy of the moment was far deeper than a touch. The boundary had just been crossed. Silas had taken the darkest, most barren part of himself and laid it bare on the wooden porch, and Clara had turned away. She had looked right at it, named it, and told him he was still a man worthy of standing. How do you do it? Silas asked softly. How do you carry Henry? Clara looked back out at the dark pasture. I keep walking, she said, because staying still means the room wins. Silas nodded slowly. He picked up his glass. He didn't drink. He just held it. Thank you, he said. The first time he had truly thanked her since she arrived. Not for the legal work, not for holding the fence line. He was thanking her for seeing him day 29. 2 days left on the contract. Clara rode the wagon back from the Higgins farm. The morning sun was bright, but the wind was cold. She didn't feel the chill, she felt alive. Tucked inside her leather satchel was the final piece of the puzzle. She had found Martha Higgins. The 60-year-old widow lived 5 miles north. Martha had a sharp memory and a sharper tongue. More importantly, Martha had been a witness to the original 1860 Montgomery survey. Clara had sat at Martha's kitchen table for 2 hours. She had explained the shifted boundary lines. Martha had been furious. She had gladly signed a sworn affidavit, notarized by the local circuit preacher, stating precisely where the original boundary markers were set. It was the final nail in Amos Thatcher's coffin. The legal net was closed. Clara had done it. She had saved the ranch. She drove the wagon into the yard. Expected to see Silas working the horses or mending gear. Instead, Silas was standing dead center, in the middle of the dirt yard. He was perfectly still. His shoulders were rigid. In his hand was a piece of crisp white paper. A horse with a county sheriff's saddle brand was tied to the hitching post. A young deputy stood on the porch, looking uncomfortable, shifting his weight from boot to boot. Clara pulled back on the reins. The wagon rolled to a stop. Something was wrong. The air felt heavy, thick with incoming weather. Climbed down from the wagon box. She grabbed her satchel. Silas, she called out, I have Martha's affidavit. The preacher notarized it. We have him. Silas didn't look up at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the paper in his hand. Silas! Clara walked closer. He might finally raised his head. The man who looked at her with profound gratitude on the porch 2 nights ago was gone. In his place was the cold, guarded cattleman from the train depot. The fortress walls had slammed back up. It was barred. Silas held the paper out. Read it, he said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. Claire took the paper. She recognized the thick county seal at the top. It was a formal legal notice, a motion to dismiss evidence. She read the first paragraph. Her blood ran cold. Thatcher had dug into her past. He had wired the courthouses in Virginia. It stated that Henry Abernathy, the man Clara had worked for, had once been formally accused of corrupt investigative practices and evidence tampering by a wealthy rancher in the Shenandoah Valley. It was a smear campaign. 5 years ago, a corrupt official they were investigating had tried to ruin Henry's reputation by filing a civil suit for fraud. The suit had been dismissed by a judge for lack of evidence. Henry had been cleared, but the record of the accusation remained. Thatcher was using it. The document argued that Clara Abernathy was trained by a known fraudster. It claimed she was a tainted witness, a professional grifter, and that any evidence she magically found against the sheriff was highly suspect and legally void. It was a dirty, brutal blow. In 1878, a woman's testimony was already fragile in front of a male judge. Tie that testimony to a dead man's tarnished reputation, and the case would crumble before it ever saw a courtroom. She lowered the paper. She looked at Silas. She expected to see anger at Thatcher. She expected to see ready to fight. Instead, she saw doubt. "Is it true?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "The accusation was made," Clara said, keeping her chin up. "It was a lie told by a guilty man trying to save his own skin. The judge threw it out. Henry was cleared." Silas stared at her. The winter was back in his eyes. A man terrified of losing the only thing he had left in the world. He was terrified of being played for a fool, and fear always makes a man reach for his oldest worst habits. "A judge threw it out," Silas repeated flatly, "but the stain is still there. It's a scare tactic." "Isla sighs," Clara said, her voice rising with urgency. "Thatcher knows he can't beat the deed, so he is trying to discredit the person reading it. We still have the dates. We have Martha's sworn word." Silas shook his head slowly. "A county judge will look at this paper," Silas said. "He will see a desperate rancher and a widow with a history of land disputes. Hell throw us out, we go to a federal judge." Clara pushed back. "We bypass the county." Silas stepped back. Distance between them. He looked at her leather satchel. He looked at her worn dress. Then he asked the question that shattered everything they had built over the last 29 days. "Did you know this was coming when you showed up here?" The yard went dead silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Clara felt the words hit her like a physical strike. It knocked the air from her lungs. "I wasn't asking about legal strategy." He was asking if she was a con artist. He was asking if she had come to Amarillo knowing her past would drag him down, using him for a warm bed and a hot meal while his ranch burned to the ground. He was asking if she was a liar. Clara stood frozen. She had worked until her fingers bled. She had sat in the dirt with his son. She had sat in the dark and held his grief. She had given him every ounce of her sharp mind and honest sweat. And at the first sign of real danger, he believed the worst of her. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. If she were a lesser woman, she might have screamed. She might have cried. She might have frantically pleaded her case, begging him to trust her. But Clara was a woman who knew her own worth, and her worth did not depend on Silas Montgomery's fragile permission. "This is not a fair-weather friend, Silas," Claire said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It held the absolute authority of a teacher addressing a failing student. "It doesn't only exist when the sky is clear and the papers are clean. You either know who I am by now, or you don't." Silas gripped his hat. His jaw was clenched so tight, the muscle twitched. "Clara, I am fighting for my life here, and I was fighting right beside you." Clara cut him off sharp. "Final. But I will not defend my honor to a man who looks at me and sees a thief." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't drop a tear. She simply turned on her heel. 30 days are almost up anyway," Clara said over her shoulder. "I will pack my bags. I'll be out of your house by morning." She walked past the deputy on the porch. She walked through the front door. The screen slammed shut behind her, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet yard. Silas stood in the dirt. He held the piece of paper in his hand. The paper that had saved him from trusting a stranger, but had just cost him the best ally he had ever known. That night, the Montgomery house was dark. The lamp in Clara's room burned until 2 in the morning. Silas knew she was packing. He didn't go inside. Couldn't. He sat on an overturned bucket in the barn, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the dirt floor. The cold seeped into his bones. At 11 o'clock, the barn door creaked. Elias walked in. The boy wore a sleeping shirt and heavy trousers. He looked at his father, sitting in the dark. Elias didn't ask about the ranch. He didn't ask about Sheriff Thatcher. The boy looked toward the house, at the single glowing window, and then looked at Silas. "What did you do to her?" Elias asked. It wasn't the question of a child. It was the judgment of a young man. Silas looked up at his son. He opened his mouth to explain, to talk about the law and the risk and the forged papers, to explain that a man has to protect what is his. But no words came out. Because sitting there in the dark, Silas realized the horrifying truth. He hadn't protected anything. He had just burned down his own house. Because he was afraid of the fire, he had nothing to say, and his silence to his son was the heaviest confession of his life. Day 30. The dawn was gray, cold. It bit right through the glass of the bedroom window. Clara stood in the middle of the small room. Her leather valise was packed. It sat by the door, heavy with the few things she owned. Her Virginia teaching certificate, her dresses, her pride. She put on her wool coat. She buttoned it to the neck. She looked out the window. The ranch yard was empty. Silas was nowhere to be seen. He was probably out on the far ridge, hiding in his work. Hiding from himself, she picked up the valise. It was time to go, but as the brass door and she stopped, she closed her eyes. She saw Amos Thatcher's smug, handsome face. She saw him sitting behind his polished desk, wearing his silver star, smiling as he stole a man out of life with a pen. Then she saw Elias the boy, sitting in the dirt after falling off his horse. Left right now, Thatcher won not just the land, he won the moral war. Silas would lose his ranch, yes, but worse, Silas would spend the rest of his life believing that no one was worth trusting. And Elias would grow up watching his father become a bitter, hollow shell. Clara let go of the doorknob. Integrity is a hard master. It doesn't ask you to do what is easy. It doesn't even ask you to do what is fair. It demands that you do what is right, even when the people you are fighting for have broken your heart. True justice isn't conditional. Don't abandon the truth just because you were insulted. Clara dropped her valise. She reached under the bed and pulled out her leather satchel. It was full of paper, heavy, lethal. She walked out of the house. She didn't look for Silas. She hitched the roan gelding to the small buckboard wagon herself. She climbed up, snapped the reins, and drove out of the yard. She was going to town. Amarillo was just waking up when she arrived. Loons were sweeping out the sawdust. The baker was firing his oven. Clara tied the roan in front of the sheriff's office. She grabbed her satchel. She pushed the heavy oak door open. It chimed loudly. Thatcher was sitting at his desk. He was drinking coffee from a porcelain cup. He looked up, surprised then. His surprise melted into that practiced, easy smile. "Mrs. Abernathy," Thatcher said. He leaned back in his chair. "I didn't expect to see you again. I heard you were taking the morning train back east. Smart choice." Clara didn't smile. She didn't offer a polite morning greeting. She walked straight to his desk. She unbuckled the leather satchel. She pulled out a thick stack of paper and dropped them with a heavy thud right next to his coffee cup. "Not here to exchange pleasant Amos, Clara." Her voice was flat, hard as iron. Thatcher looked at the papers. "Soft. If Silas sent you to beg, you're wasting your breath. I already filed the notice of dismissal. Your husband was a known fraud, Mrs. Abernathy. Any evidence you bring me is legally tainted. No county judge will look at it." Clara rested both hands on his desk. She leaned in. "You are absolutely right," Clara said quietly. "A county judge won't look at it, because I didn't send it to a county judge." Thatcher stopped smiling. "I know how you play the game," Clara said, keeping her eyes locked on his. "You own the local courts, you own the clerks, but you don't own the federal magistrate in Fort Worth." Thatcher sat up straight. "Fort Worth last night," Clara said, her voice steady and rhythmic. "I gave a duplicate set of these files to the Wells Fargo night rider. They are on an express carriage to the federal courthouse. They contain the forged survey logs. They contain the floating boundary R maps. And they contain a sworn, notarized affidavit from Martha Higgins, verifying the 1,860 boundary lines." Thatcher's face lost its color. "Martha Higgins is an old widow. Her word against a lawman won't hold up. You keep underestimating widows, Amos. It's a terrible habit." Clara stood tall. She spoke with the sharp, clear authority of the educator she was. She was delivering a lesson he would never forget. "You assume that because I am a woman, I am legally invisible," Clara said. Her words cut through the quiet room. "You think I have no standing to bring a claim. But you should read your law books before you try to steal land. The Homestead Act of 1862 guarantees it. Federal law protects a woman's right to own, defend, and testify for property. I don't need a husband. I don't need to stand in the shadow of a man to drag you into a federal courtroom. My name alone is enough to swear out a warrant for forgery." Thatcher stared at her. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "If you push this claim," Clara continued, "the federal marshal will ride into Amarillo, audit your ledgers, and when he finds the shifted map, you won't just lose your badge. You will die in a territorial prison." She tapped the stack of papers on his desk. "This is your copy. Withdraw your claim, Kinas. Or the federal rider comes for you on Monday." Clara didn't wait for his answer. She didn't need to. She had seen the absolute terror in his eyes. She turned and walked out the door. The chime rang behind her. The Texas wind whipped her coat as she stood on the boardwalk. She took a deep breath. The air smelled like dust and victory. She had done what she came to do. She had honored the dead man's letter. Now she was truly finished. It took her 2 hours to drive the buckboard back to the Montgomery ranch. She expected the yard to be empty. She expected to walk quietly into the house, grab her valise, and have Ilias drive her back to the depot. But as the wagon crested the final hill, she saw him. Silas was standing at the main gate. He wasn't working. He wasn't hiding. He was just standing in the dirt, watching the road. Ela stood a few paces behind him. Clara the wagon to a stop. She tied the brake. She didn't climb down. She just looked at Silas from the wagon box. Silas walked up to the side of the wagon. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot. His face was drawn tight with regret. He took his hat off. He held it in his hands. "The Higgins rode by an hour ago," Silas said. His voice was ragged. "She told me you went to town. She told me what took to Thatcher." Clara kept her hands on the leather reins. "Thatcher will drop the claim." "I know," Silas said. He looked down at the dirt, then forced himself to look up, right into her eyes. He didn't flinch away from the pain he had caused. "I asked you a question yesterday," Silas said. "I asked if you knew the trouble was coming. I accused you of using me." "You did," Clara said plainly. "The worst thing I have ever done." Silas' voice shook just a fraction. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't blame the stress, or Thatcher, or his past. He owned his failure completely. "I didn't look at you with the eyes of a partner, Clara. I looked at you with the eyes of a coward. I was so terrified of losing this dirt that I turned on the only person who actually stood in the mud with me." Elias watched his father from the porch. The boy was learning what it looked like when a real man made a mistake. A real man didn't hide. He stood in the daylight and bled his pride dry to make it right. "You deserved better," Silas said quietly. "You are the most honorable person I have ever known." "I am profoundly sorry." Clara looked at him. She saw the absolute crushing sincerity in his face. She loosened her grip on the reins. The anger that had kept her spine straight all morning finally dissolved. What was left was just a deep, quiet ache. "Apology accepted, Silas," Clara said softly. She climbed down from the wagon. Silas reached out a hand to steady her, but he didn't try to pull her close. He respected the distance. They stood in the yard. The war was over. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, painting the western sky in bruised purples and burnt orange. The house was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in a month, Silas didn't have to look over his shoulder for the law. Clara was in the kitchen, washing the dust from her hands at the basin. She was still leaving. The contract was done. The 30 days were up. Silas' apology had healed the wound, but an apology to reason to stay. She had no place here anymore. A buggy rattled into the yard. Clara dried her hands and stepped onto the porch. Silas was already walking out of the barn. "Martha Higgins." The old woman climbed down from her buggy, carrying a small, rusted tin box. She marched up to the porch, her boots thumping heavily on the wood. "Afternoon, Silas." "Clara," Martha said briskly. She set the tin box on the porch table. "Martha," Silas said, tipping his hat, "I owe you my life for signing that paper." "You owe, Clara," Martha corrected sharply. "I just signed my name." She built the gallows. Martha tapped the tin box. "But that's not why I'm here. I came to bring you this. It belonged to old Arthur Pendleton. When he passed away in town, the doctor gave me his things. Said Arthur wanted me to hold them." Silas frowned. "Arthur's things?" Martha looked at Clara. Her sharp old eyes softened. "There's something you both need to know about the letter." Clara stepped closer. "The letter he sent my husband." "Arthur didn't send that letter to your husband," Martha said quietly. Silas crossed his arms. "What do you mean?" "It had Henry's name on the envelope." "It had Henry's name," Martha agreed, "because a woman traveling alone to Texas needs a cover story. But Arthur knew Henry was dead." Clara froze. The porch suddenly felt very cold. "He knew a cattle drover passed through Wichita Falls 2 months before Arthur wrote that letter," Martha explained. "He brought the news. Arthur knew Henry was in the ground, but he also knew something else. He knew the truth about Henry's investigations." Martha looked directly at Clara. "Arthur knew Henry didn't read those law books. He knew it was you, Clara. Arthur told me. That Abernathy woman has a mind like a steel trap. If anyone can outsmart Amos Thatcher, it's her." Clara stared at the tin box, her breath caught in her throat. "He sent the letter knowing I would open it," Clara whispered. "He did," Martha said. "He slipped the train money inside, put your dead husband's name on it so the master wouldn't ask questions, and he cast his line into the water." Silas looked stunned. He manipulated her. He dragged a grieving widow halfway across the country on a gamble. "No, Silas!" Clara's voice was firm. She looked up, her eyes were shining, but no tears fell. He didn't manipulate me, Clara said softly. The realization washed over her like a warm rain. He gave me a choice. Martha, a wise no nod. This was the final lesson, the deepest truth of the whole story. Care isn't a rope you tie around someone's neck to pull them to safety, Martha said, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had lived a long, hard life. True care is an open door. Arthur couldn't force you to get on that train, Clara. He couldn't force you to help Silas. He just built the door. He let you decide if you were brave enough to walk through it. Clara touched her chest. For 14 months, she had felt useless. Invisible, she thought her life had ended the day Henry died. But Arthur Pendleton, a dying old cowhand, had seen her. He had recognized her brilliance, and he had trusted her with the lives of the people he loved. The turn to Silas, and Arthur knew you, Silas. He knew you'd rather choke on your own blood than ask for help. He knew you needed someone who wouldn't put up with your stubborn nonsense. He sent you an equal. Martha patted the tin box, turned around, and walked back to her buggy. You two figure out the rest. I have chickens to feed. She drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, beautiful truth hanging in the air. Silas and Clara stood on the porch. The sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned dark blue. 30 days, Silas said softly. The words hung between them. The contract was over. Clara looked at him. Silas took a slow breath. He stepped closer to her. He didn't look like a proud, hardened cattle boss anymore. He looked like a man who had finally put down a terrible weight. I don't need a lawyer anymore, Clara, Silas said. His voice was low, rhythmic. Thatcher is beaten. The deed is safe. The ranch doesn't need saving. He took another step, close enough now that she could smell the leather and clean sweat on his shirt. I don't need a housekeeper. Elias doesn't need a nursemaid. Silas looked down into her eyes. I am not asking you to stay because I need you to survive, Silas said. That was the mistake I made 6 years ago. I thought need was the same thing as love. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. I am asking you to stay, Silas whispered, because I want to know the woman who sat in the dirt with my son. I want to know the woman who stood up to a corrupt lawman. I want to drink coffee on this porch with you for the rest of my days, not because we have to, but because we choose to. It was the most honest thing any man had ever said to her. It wasn't a desperate plea, it wasn't a trap, it was an open door. I looked at the dark, vast expanse of the Texas Panhandle. It was a harsh place, a difficult place, but standing here, next to this man, it suddenly looked like home. She looked back up. It's a slow, genuine smile broke across her face. Then you had better go inside, Clara said gently, and unpack my bag. 3 years. Time is a funny thing on the Texas Panhandle. It doesn't move in hours or days. It moves in seasons, in the height of the buffalo grass, in the deep weathered lines that show up around a man's eyes. The spring of 1881 point, the Montgomery Ranch hadn't changed much on the outside. It was still 2,400 acres of hard dirt and stubborn cattle. The wind still howled. The fences still needed mending. The mornings were still bitter cold, but the inside of the house was different. For the first time in nearly a decade, the house felt awake, not just occupied, awake. Clara Montgomery sat at the heavy oak desk in the ranch office. It was the same desk where she had unraveled Amos Thatch's lie 3 years ago. Changed the room. She had claimed the space. She had put up tall pine shelves for her books. She had asked the ranch hands to widen the window facing south, so the room could catch the morning sun. She was writing. Her fingers were stained with dark blue ink. She was drafting an article. Her 3rd one this year. It was going to a prestigious legal journal in Boston. The title written across the top of the page was bold: The Invisible Landowner, Protecting Women's Homestead Rights in the Western Territories. The door creaked open. Silas walked in. He wore his work clothes, smelling of leather, sweet feed, and morning frost. He carried a tin cup of hot black coffee. He didn't ask if she wanted it. He didn't interrupt her train of thought. He just walked over, set the cup gently near her elbow, and stood behind her chair. He leaned down. He read the wet ink on the page over her shoulder. That S a strong paragraph, Silas said. He wasn't humoring her. He meant it. Silas read everything she wrote, not because he was an expert on federal law. Because he knew her voice. He knew when she was writing from her gut and when she was holding back. Is it too sharp? Clara asked, resting her pen on the blotter. Truth is supposed to be sharp, Silas said, his voice a low, steady rumble. If it doesn't cut a little, folks tend to ignore it. A law isn't worth the paper printed on if it only protects the people who already have power. Clara smiled. She leaned back against him. He rested a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. It was a simple touch. Grounding, quiet, there was no grand, sweeping romance here. Flowery poetry. Love in your twilight years doesn't look like love in your 20s. It doesn't burn like a wild brush fire, consuming everything in its path. It grows like an oak tree. Slow, deep, with roots strong enough to hold the earth together when the storms come. They had married in September of 1878. It hadn't been a grand affair. There was no white lace dress. No church bells ringing across a town square. They stood in Martha Higgins' front parlor. Local circuit preacher read the vows. Clara wore her best navy wool dress. Silas wore a suit he hadn't touched in 18 years. It still fit, but Martha had been forced to let the shoulders out. Silas had grown since he was a young man, not just in physical size, in weight, in spirit. Elias had been the best man. The boy had bought the wedding himself. He had saved his ranch wages for 3 months, keeping it a secret from everyone. When the preacher asked for the band, Elias handed it to his father. The 16-year-old boy looked at Clara. "What do I call you now?" Elias had asked, right there in the middle of the ceremony. "Whatever feels true to you," Clara had answered. She refused to force a title. Respect couldn't be demanded, it had to be given. "Clara is fine," the boy had decided with a firm nod. "It's a good name, strong, no forced mother, no." Pretending the past didn't exist. They were building something new on honest ground, and that honesty had paid off. Silas reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a folded paper envelope. "Stagecoach rider came through town," Silas said. "Brought a letter from Fort Worth." Clara's face lit up. She took the envelope. Elias was 19 now. He wasn't breaking wild colts in the dirt pen anymore. He was sitting in a brick classroom, studying the law. It had been his choice, completely his own. He had watched Clara dismantle a corrupt sheriff with nothing but paper and a sharp mind. He had seen the power of the law when wielded by a righteous hand. Clara sliced the envelope open with her paper knife. Handwriting was messy, rushed, the handwriting of a young man with too many thoughts and not enough time. It started the way they always did. "Dear Clara," he wrote about his classes, about the crowded city streets, the noise, the terrible food at the boarding house. Then came the real reason for the letter. My property professor says a deed transfer without a male guarantor is legally void in the southern counties. I stood up and argued that the 1,862 homestead provisions override local county prejudice. He laughed at me. He asked for federal precedent. "Please send me the Virginia case files you used. I want to nail him to the wall on Tuesday." Clara laughed, a bright, clear sound that bounced off the wooden walls of the office. "What does the boy say?" Silas asked, pulling up a wooden chair beside her desk. "He's picking fights with his professors," Clara said, her eyes shining with pride. "And he wants me to send him my ammunition." Silas chuckled. He shook his head. "Lord help that professor." Silas didn't feel jealous that his son was writing to Clara for advice. He felt profound gratitude. He just hadn't asked his father how to win a legal fight. He asked Clara because he respected her mind. He saw her as an equal partner in the family. You don't have to share blood to build a legacy. You just have to share respect. A child thrives when given the space to learn from everyone around him, without the suffocating weight of a parent's ego. "I'll have to dig out the old ledgers," Clara said, already reaching for the bottom drawer of her desk. "I think I still have the transcript from the Shenandoah ruling." "Take your time," Silas said. He stood up. "I've got to ride out to the ridge checking the water lines. Back before sundown." He paused at the door. He looked back at her. "You look good at that desk, Clara," he said softly. Then he walked out. Clara watched him go. Her heart swelled, a quiet, steady rhythm. Late afternoon, the sun began its slow bleed into the western horizon. The sky turned brilliant shades of violet, orange, and bruised red. Clara walked out onto the porch. She wiped her hands on a cloth. Finished her article. The case files were packed and ready to be mailed to Elias in the morning. Silas was already there. He was sitting in the rocking chair. His boots were propped up on the porch rail. He was watching the herd graze in the far distance. He stood up when she came out. He offered her the wooden porch swing. They sat together. The silence between them was easy now, comfortable like a well-worn saddle. They didn't need to fill the air with empty chatter to prove they were happy. "I heard news in town today," Silas said quietly. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "Amos Thatcher was moved to a federal penitentiary in Kansas this morning. The judge gave him 20 years. Clara nodded slowly. She didn't gloat. There was no joy in watching a man ruin his own life. He built his own cell long before he ever saw the inside of a courtroom, Clara said. He thought he was untouchable, Silas mused. He thought, because he had the badge, he was the law. A man who believes he is above the law usually forgets that the law is just an agreement between people, Clara said softly, the educator in her speaking. It's a promise we make to treat each other as human beings. When you stop respecting people, when you look at a widow or a poor farmer and see nothing but an easy mark, the agreement breaks. Law turns on you. Silas looked at her. The wind caught a loose strand of her silvering hair. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against her cheek, and tucked the hair behind her ear. I was a proud, foolish man 3 years ago, Silas said. The confession was gentle, stripped of all defense. I thought asking for help made me weak. I thought I had to carry the whole world on my back to prove I was a man. Pride is a heavy coat, Clara agreed. It keeps you warm for a while, but eventually, it drags you underwater. I'm glad you didn't let me drown. Silas smiled, a real deep smile that reached all the way to his eyes. I'm glad you got on that train, Clara. It was a simple sentence, but it held the weight of the entire world. She looked out at the rolling plains. She thought of Wichita Falls, the dark, tiny room, the $4.06 in her purse, the feeling of drowning in her own grief, convinced that her lifer, Pendleton, an old dying cowhand lying in a rented bed, using his last breath to scheme a way to save 2 lonely people. She thought of Henry. Good, quiet Henry, the man she had loved, the man whose name on an envelope had been the key to unlock the whole thing. The arrest letter had been a massive gamble, a wild, desperate throw of the dice. It had been an arrangement made by a ghost. Clara rested her head against Scylla Classett's broad shoulder. He wrapped a heavy arm around her. Sometimes, Clara thought, the people we lose don't really leave us. They don't vanish into the dirt. They just step back. They leave behind tools, a memory, a lesson, a piece of paper with a forged date. Leave a door cracked open. You can't force a person to heal. You can't command someone to let go of their grief. Pride can build a magnificent fortress, but it takes an open, willing heart to build a home. You have to choose to walk through the door. Clara closed her eyes. The Texas wind whipped across the porch, but it didn't feel so cold anymore. Mr. Pendleton's letter was addressed to a dead man, but in the end it was opened by a woman who desperately needed a reason to live again. And sometimes, the good Lord's miracles are just exactly that simple. Some characters in this story may display flawed judgment, emotional instability, or morally questionable choices as part of their personal journeys. Portrayals are intended to explore human emotion and conflict within a fictional context and should not be interpreted as guidance or endorsement.
If this story moved something real in you, let it live beyond this moment. Leave a like. Share it with someone whose light the world has been trying to dim. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so the next story finds you right where you are. Let's talk about the character this story almost never shows us. The one who never appears on a porch, never sits at a kitchen table, never holds a fence post in the freezing dawn. Arthur Pendleton. 71 years old, dying of lung rot in a rented bed somewhere in Amarillo, Texas. A cowhand with no children, no land, no legacy to speak of. At least not the kind the world bothers to record. Arthur is gone before the first page turns. And yet, when you sit with this story long enough, you begin to realize that everything that happens, every repaired fence, every forged document exposed, every moment of hard-won trust between 2 broken people, flows directly from one dying man's extraordinary understanding of human nature. Arthur Pendleton is the story's true genius, and what he understood is worth every minute we spend thinking about it. Arthur understood 3 things that most people never learn, even with a full lifetime to practice. The first is this: he knew the difference between a person's public face and their private truth. The entire world saw Henry Abernathy as the investigator, the confident cattle buyer who walked into courthouses and handed judges the evidence that sent corrupt men to prison. Arthur had watched closely enough, long enough, to know that the evidence didn't come from Henry. It came from the woman who stayed home, the woman whose name never appeared on a single official report. the woman who read law books by candlelight, while the rest of the county assumed she was darning socks. In 1878, in a world that had decided women were legally invisible, Arthur Pendleton looked at Clara and saw the most dangerous mind in the Shenandoah Valley. He didn't just notice her, he remembered her. He carried that knowledge all the way to his deathbed, and then he used it as the last meaningful act of his life. That is the first lesson this story offers us, tucked inside Arthur's choice. The people around us are almost always more than what the world has labeled them. The question is whether we are paying close enough attention to see it. The second thing Arthur understood is harder to articulate, but it is the most important truth the story carries. He knew that you cannot rescue a proud person by rescuing them. Silas Montgomery would have let his ranch sink into Thatcher's pocket before he would have walked into a stranger's office and said the words, "I need help." And Clara Abernathy would have spent the rest of her days teaching other people's children in a shuttered schoolhouse, her legal mind quietly going dark, before she would have knocked on a rancher's door and said, "I am more than I appear." They were both drowning in the same river, and neither of them would reach for a rope. Arthur knew this, so he did something that reveals a profound and rare wisdom. He didn't throw them a rope. He built a current. He wrote a letter addressed to a dead man, slipped $60 inside, and pointed it at a woman he knew would understand exactly what it meant to be seen when the rest of the world had stopped looking. He didn't manipulate Clara. He created a condition in which Clara could choose to be herself, fully, without apology, in a place where her gifts were desperately needed. That is the deepest form of love available to us. Not the love that saves people from their circumstances, but the love that builds a door and trusts them to be brave enough to walk through it. And then there is Elias, the boy who bought his father's wedding ring with 3 months of saved wages and kept it secret from everyone. The boy who walked into a dark barn at 11 o'clock at night and asked his father, in the voice of a young man, rather than a child, "What did you do to her?" The boy who is 19 years old and studying law in Fort Worth, writing letters that begin, "Dear Clara," and end with requests for federal case precedents, so he can nail his property professor to the wall on a Tuesday. Elias is what this story is actually building toward, quietly, patiently, the way the best things are built. He is the proof that the most powerful thing one generation